Hello class, welcome to BBA 432 International Business Management. Today I will be covering chapter 4, which is the economic environments of international business. Here are the learning objectives of the chapter. So let's talk a little bit about what this chapter basically covers. So we will be looking at the economic environments facing multinational companies. So when companies source, manufacture, or market products in different countries, they encounter fascinating and almost often challenging economic environments. So in this chapter, we will explore the economic environments of countries in which multinational corporations operate. We will discuss the importance of economic analysis and identify the major dimensions of that process. We will also compare and contrast key macroeconomic indicators such as economic growth, inflation, and the budget surpluses and deficits reflected in the balance of payments. And finally, we will summarize the chapter by discussing the characteristics of the major types of economic systems and explore the principles of economic freedom. Here is the learning objective 1, which is to explain the value of economic analysis. As you can appreciate in the international business or in the global economy, cultural, political, and legal system often influence a company's decision on where, when, and how to do business. In this chapter, we will address the economic influences in IB. So here are the various principles that help managers better assess economic environments. First one being the system complexity, the second one, market dynamism, and the third, market interdependence. Systems complexity basically refers to the fact that economic environments always face very dynamic systems, right? So it's not easy to represent a country's economic performance by using a single dimension only, okay? So we have to look at the complexity of the economic system. So economic systems are influenced by a number of factors, including political, legal, and cultural factors, which make the system more and more complex, right? When we talk about market dynamism, we're really talking about the evolving circumstances of the marketplace, right? This evolving circumstances of the marketplace is always compounded by disruptive situations and instability in the economy, and also the very puzzling and sometimes surprising trends. These market dynamism also generates certain anomalies and exceptions that convert comebacks into collapses. Basically, we're living in such an economy that illustrates both stability and instability at the same time. Market interdependence refers to cross-national interdependence, right? Or interdependence among different countries. So this interdependence naturally moderates the forces of supply and demand and their pricing signals. Adjusting analysis for actions and reactions across an expanding scope of market complicates our interpretation of the international business activities. The second objective of this course is to explain the value of economic analysis. So this chart basically shows that managers must be able to navigate the type of economic environment, the degree of economic freedoms, the drivers of economic performance, and the orientation of economic systems. Okay? Here is the second learning objective, which is to differentiate different types of economic environments. As you can see here, there are three types of economic systems: developing, and economies in transition. So all of these types of economic systems are distinguished by different levels of development, right? In the case of developed countries, right, in the case of developed countries, we have Western European countries, United States, Canada, Australia. They have a very robust economic environment marked by wide-ranging activities. They have efficient capital movements, stable institutions, extensive infrastructure, international trade and investments, advanced technologies, and higher economic freedom. In the second category, we have the developing countries, right? Developing countries are the countries that are in the process of catching up with the developed economies. Okay? So these countries are in the process of catching up with developing countries. But unlike the developed countries, these economies have uneven economic environment that is marked by narrow market activities, inefficient capital movement, resistance to foreign ownership, trade restrictions and regulations, imperfect competition, unstable institutions, limited infrastructure, and lower economic freedoms. When we look at the third category, the economies in transition, right? Before talking about the economies of transition, under the developing countries, we have most of the middle income nations like Brazil, Argentina, most of the countries in Latin America or Southern Europe like Turkey, right? Those countries would be considered as developing, and some of the East Asian economies like Southeast Asia, Taiwan, Thailand, they're also considered under the developing economies. Whereas the economies in transition, in these economies, great range marks the economic performance among the developing economies, precisely because different economies experience different levels of development at different rates. So at the low end of transitioning economies, there are countries marked by very fragile political institutions, heavy indebtedness, poorly performing markets, and ongoing conflict, especially ongoing ethnic and civil wars. So we have, under the economies in transition, we have countries like Afghanistan, Democratic Republic of Congo, so forth and so on, or Zambia, or Nigeria. Most of the countries in Africa fall under economies in transition. And these economies, the average per capita income is among the lowest in the world, okay? So as I said, different reasons explain these different levels of economic development. There is no single answer. What explains the economic development of the United States, or what explains the economic development of England, right? So you need to look at different reasons of why those countries are more developed than the rest of the world. So we need to pay more attention to the economic, political, legal, and cultural influences on development. Okay? Here is the learning objective 2. We need to learn how to differentiate the types of economic environments. These factors assist in a country's economic development, right? So we have the economic factors, right? the political legal factors, which we already learned in chapter 3, and the cultural factors. It's important to study this review sheet or this chart. It's important to distinguish the economic factor from the cultural factor. For instance, business efficiency, degree of literacy, educational opportunity, entrepreneurial and executive expertise, equality of income, right? Poverty, productivity fall under economic factors. Whereas under political and legal factors, we have variables pertaining to the basis of law, rule of law, the existence of political freedoms, political risk, sanctity of property rights, the stability of public policy, whereas under cultural factors, we have variables pertaining to the culture of that nation, like how people perceive fairness, equality, and justice, how they perceive the free enterprise, whether or not the culture is individualistic versus collectivistic, whether or not there is a sizable and stable middle class, and whether or not there are transparent commercial and business transactions or not. So we really need to look at those factors to be able to better appreciate the cultural factors affecting economic development. Right? And then we have now the learning objective 2. We continue with this learning objective and apply the learning objective to the map, right, to differentiate the different types of economic environment. So this map basically shows the emerging economies of the world, right? The emerging economies are highlighted in green color. So Russia, China, India, Brazil, Colombia, Chile, Turkey, Saudi Arabia. These are the emerging economies of the world which are in the process of transitioning. So they are in the process of developing, and they're in the process of transitioning to a more developed economy. But not all of these economies are at the same level. Of course, South Africa's economy is different from Turkey's economy, or Egypt's economy is different from Turkey's economy. Okay, so you need to look at the other factors that influence, cultural and political factors that also influence their levels of economic development. Right? And then we will also focus on this notion of economic freedom, because all advanced and developed economies have economic freedoms that create opportunities for their citizens to make a higher standard of living. Economic freedom creates opportunities, don't forget. It creates opportunities that allows people, the citizens of that nation, to make a better standard of living. But there's also the very precise definition of economic freedom. Economic freedom, I'm defining, please pay attention to this definition, which is very important. Economic freedom is the absolute right of property ownership, fully realize freedoms of movement for labor, capital, and goods, and an absolute absence of coercion or constraint of economic liberty beyond the extent necessary for citizens to protect and maintain liberty itself. Okay? So economic freedom is the absolute right of property ownership. Fully realize freedoms of movement for labor, capital, and good, and an absolute absence of coercion or constraint of economic liberty beyond the extent necessary for citizens to protect and maintain liberty itself. And don't forget, such a clearly defined, such a detailed understanding of economic freedom is very, very important, because we always assume that economic freedoms can also assist economic development. What this means is that economically free countries support activities that create income and generate wealth. Successful entrepreneurs map paths that others follow to build better lives. So, economic freedom does not signify the absence of government. To the contrary, because economic freedoms always require protection, right? It is not simply the existence of private property that defines economic freedom, but it is the government protection of the private property. Private property needs to be protected by the government against any type of nationalization or government ownership of property. Okay? So, don't forget, as I said, economic freedom does not signify the absence of government. Ultimately, freedom requires protection. So, if you look at the Economic Freedom Index, you will see that it estimates economic freedom in a particular nation. In principle, this index measures the degree that a nation accepts Adam Smith's thesis that basic institutions that protect the liberty of individuals to pursue their own economic interests result in greater prosperity for the larger society. Okay? So we will use this Economic Freedom Index to see how an index was developed, right, by the Heritage Foundation to measure different levels of economic freedoms that apply to different countries. Okay. So in this learning objective, we will explain the idea of economic freedom, right? Basically, as you can clearly see here, this chart shows that the greater the economic freedoms, the higher the standards of living. So why is this important? Because as I said, economic freedoms create opportunities for people to increase their standards of living, which is a degree of wealth and the material comfort available to a person, right? So higher the standards of living, better economic opportunities and greater economic freedoms, and also the greater degree of wealth and the material comfort available to a person of that country. So, but don't forget, standard of living is more like a general concept. It doesn't simply apply to the individual, it applies to the nation itself. It is a level of income, comforts, and services available, and it is generally applied to a society. So it's a public term. This whole notion of standard of living is applied to a society rather than to an individual. Okay? Again, standard of living is important. It's a very, very relevant and important concept that is highly correlated with economic freedoms because it also contributes to an individual's quality of life. Okay? So here is a learning objective 3, which is all about explaining the idea of economic freedom. After we review the definitions listed here for economic freedom classification and characteristic, we will review the map in the next slide that shows the level of economic freedom. So think about it. Think about these different levels developed by the Heritage Foundation. So they have the economic freedom score that ranges from 80 to all the way 49.9. So these numbers also correspond to different classifications of freedom, right? So we have free economies, mostly free, moderately free, and mostly unfree, and repressed economies. So look at the countries listed under each class. So we will talk about it in the next slide. So after reviewing this economic freedom table, think about this question. Do you think the United States will have a free classification? Do you think that the United States will have a free classification? What about United Kingdom? What about France? What about Russia? What about Saudi Arabia? So this will be the topic of the next slide. Thanks for listening to my lecture. I will continue my lecture with the map of economic freedom in the next slide. See you shortly. Have a good day. Bye-bye. We will be covering the same chapter, but the different slide. Basically, the map of economic freedom. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.